Battleground Ideas, where faith, philosophy, and culture collide. I'm Chuck Mason, and I want to say thank you for your time because I know that it's important. So, our discussion that we're going to tackle at the moment today is, should you be concerned about critical race theory? Now, this is part one of a two-part series, and as soon as we get part two up, we'll have that link in the comments section below. But what we want to do is take a look at the original documents that led to, the original ideas that led to critical race theory, break down critical race theory so that you can have the information you need. You're not going to get my analysis my position until the end. I think it should be fairly straightforward once you see the information. But I want to be able to give it to you so that we can do a deep dive on it so you can know where it comes from, what it is, and where it's going. And so we're going to begin. Now, this first part, we're going to take a look at Marxism and critical theory that led up to the foundations of critical race theory. Now, it may seem a bit of a journey, but if you hang out through parts 1 and part 2, by the time we reach the end of part 2, you will understand why this was important. So, let's get started. So, in order to have a discussion about critical race theory, we have to ask, what is it? Well, critical race theory is a broad school of thought developed at Harvard University in the late 1980s. Critical race theory is born from critical theory, which is an advancement of Marxism. And in order to understand the implications and impact of critical race theory, one must first understand Marxism. So, what is Marxism? Marxism is a theory of suffering and redemption proposed originally by Karl Marx. He couched it in early economics. Today, there's been quite a bit of transformation. But what you need to know for not only for today's discussion, but to understand the divide we have in our country, culturally, is this. Marx proposed that all of the suffering that people see in any society, in any community, in any culture, was dependent upon the systems of society. Corrupt systems of society created corrupt societies themselves, and the corruption, the exploitation, the murder, war, famine, difficulty, you name it. So consequently, you could redeem humanity from suffering, and the redemption occurred by destroying the corrupt systems of society and installing new ones that were built on a system of equity. Or in our today's words, we would say equality of outcome. So, Marxism proposes that the suffering and redemption of the world depends on these systems and institutions. Institutions that are built on exploitation and oppression and victimization are responsible for everything: suffering, war, death, famine, crime, addiction in society. Institutions built on equity and fairness bring forth the end of all that is negative, and they usher in a utopia where peace reigns. So peace and justice, suffering and exploitation, they're in the hands of the systems of societal institutions. Marxism demands individual conformity to systems of equality to ensure social justice, and declares individuals who participate in systems of exploitation and oppression guilty of murder and held fully responsible. Now, I'm going to read a quote from Marx, and this is from his preface to Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Okay? And these are his words, it's not inclusive, so take it up with Marx. In the social production that men carry on, they enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. Relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material forces of production. So, listen to this. The sum total of these relations of production, that is the economy and a capitalist system, constitutes the economic structure of society. That is the real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which corresponds definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and intellectual processes of life. Listen to this. It is not the consciousness of men which determines their existence. It is, on the contrary, their social existence which determines their consciousness. So, for Marx, the construction of society, that any time your initial beginning foundations, like for Marx, it was a capitalist economy. That capitalist economy then influences and becomes the backbone for your political and your legal structure, which in turn creates your society. And that society is responsible for the intellectual life of human beings. And ultimately, his last sentence here is critical. It is not the consciousness of men which determines their existence. It is, on the contrary, their social existence which determines their consciousness. So for Marx, your thoughts and your actions were determined by the structure of the society in which you live. It is the social institutions that create social consciousness. And that social consciousness creates thoughts, and those thoughts lead to actions. So in a corrupt society, they're going to create corrupt institutions, corrupt social institutions. They're going to create a corrupt social consciousness, and that corrupt social consciousness is going to be responsible for all of the negative outcomes that you see. So in Marx's mind, individuals, in Marx's mind, what we would call crime today is not the free will actions of individuals who have fallen short of some hopeful moral criteria that we at least recognize would be important for people to conform their lives to, that we don't see social chaos. Marx didn't see it that way. What Marx said was this: an individual who's at the lower end of an income inequality, of a hierarchy, let's say somebody living in an impoverished or in an urban environment, or let's say rural America. Okay, that individual who decides that he or she doesn't like, they don't like being at the lower end of that hierarchy. Let's say they go to Jeff Bezos and absorb some of his property. And they keep it and they redistribute it to their neighbors, to help raise their level of their economic ability or economic status. Okay? That's not a crime. In our modern day, that would be considered theft. No, in Marx's mind, that was necessary. That was an act of our words today would be social justice. And the reason is because that individual was forced to do that by society, because Marx saw the inequalities of capitalism as theft. Now, here's how this worked. Here's how this works. So, I'm going to put this into categories that we can understand. I'm going to make you a capitalist. Okay? So let's say you own a business and you hire me, and I'm the worker. And I agree to work for $8 an hour, and I agree to work for 10 hours a day. So at the end of the day, I've made wages of $80, but as a process of working, I've created, let's say, $300 worth of value for the company. So at the end of the day, I'm paid $80. So there's $220 worth of value left over. From that, the capitalist would take whatever portion he needed to pay for business expenses, and then he had a profit. In capitalism, the capitalist keeps the profit. But Marx said, because the capitalist did not distribute those resources equally across all members of the business, all the workers, that Marx viewed that as theft. He called it wage slavery and imperialist war. And he considered that to be the equivalent of an actual physical war being perpetrated upon the working classes of capitalist societies. And in his mind, that war was responsible for all death, famine, abuse, you could say alcohol abuse, drug addiction, anything negative, and it destroyed anything of value of any society that became before it. And Marx declared that the systems that were corrupt needed to be torn down and destroyed, and new ones to be replaced, and they would be replaced with those to bring what we would call equity today. Now, that's his theory of suffering. Marx overlooks quite a number of factors. I mean, individuals can go find different jobs. They can go educate themselves to gain skills, to gain better wages. They can take their experience and turn that into a better position in a job. They can start a business on their own. There's a tremendous amount of mobility within capitalist systems. But that didn't mean anything to Marx. So, in Marx's mind, the way that you redeemed the world from suffering was you must destroy the corrupt institutions of society. And this, for Marx, was an absolute moral imperative because, in Marx's mind, institutions of oppression equaled slavery, institutions of oppression equal murder, institutions of oppression equal victimization. So, destroying the systems meant you deliver humanity from slavery, murder, exploitation, and war. Redemption occurs when corrupt institutions are replaced with those achieve equity, or what we would say in our day, equality of outcome. Equity remedies inequalities that drive exploitation, the ability for some to do better at the expense of others who have less. Ensuring that everyone has similar outcomes restricts the ability for someone to gain more at someone else's expense. In Marx's mind, equity ends exploitation and it brings forth utopia. Now, Marxists believed this. And I'm going to read now from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This comes from the abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago. This is pages 171 and 172. And I want you to listen closely. And he writes, didn't Marx and Engels teach that the old bourgeois machinery of compulsion had to be broken up and a new one created immediately in its place? And included in the machinery of compulsion were the army, the police, the courts, and the prisons. How, in establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, could they delay with a new type of prison? Thus we can observe the leading idea of the archipelago of forced labor, that this had been advanced in the first month after the October Revolution. And even while sitting peacefully among the fragrant hay mowings of Roslov and listening to the buzzing bumblebees, Lenin could not help but ponder the future penal system. Even then, he had things worked out and he reassured us. And Solzhenitsyn quotes Lenin, the suppression of the minority of exploiters, the capitalists, by the majority of the hired slaves of yesterday is a matter so comparatively easy, simple, and natural that is going to cost much less in blood and will be much cheaper for humanity than the preceding suppression of the majority by the minority. According to the estimates of the Emigre professor of statistics Kurganov, this, quote, comparatively easy, unquote, internal repression cost us, from the beginning of the October Revolution up to 1959, a total of 66 million lives. We, of course, cannot vouch for this figure, but we have none of that is official, and just as soon as the official figure is issued, specialists can make the necessary critical comparisons. Now let me break this down for you. And notice what Solzhenitsyn says. Didn't Marx and Engels teach that the old bourgeois machinery of compulsion, that is, the capitalist system, had to be broken up and a new one created immediately in its place? And included in the machinery of compulsion were the army, the police, the courts, and the prisons. Does that sound familiar? And that this concept was there from the outset of Vladimir Lenin's application of Marxism through the Russian Revolution of October 1917. Now, notice what Solzhenitsyn chooses. He says, and even while sitting peacefully among the fragrant hay mowings of Roslov and listening to buzzing bumblebees, Lenin could not help ponder the future penal system. For even then, he had worked things out, reassuring us that in this pastoral, peaceful setting, before the revolution even occurs, Lenin understands that there needs to be a system of repression. There needs to be a concentration camp system in order to deal with capitalists and anybody who even spoke a word of opposition. Welcome to cancel culture. And this is what Lenin writes: the suppression of the minority of exploiters, the suppression of capitalists by those who were at one time oppressed, the workers, is so easy, simple, and natural, and it is going to cost much less in blood, will be much cheaper for humanity than the preceding suppression of the majority, that were the workers, by capitalists. In Lenin's mind, and in Marxists' minds, capitalism murders. I mean, It's an indirect murder, but it's murder. And if ultimately 66 million lives were piled up, that was a pittance and compared to the amount of murder that the corrupt system of capitalism created. Fair trade? This is Marxism. It's one of the deadliest ideologies the modern world has ever known, and it is one of the most unfortunate buried secrets in all of history and academia. For few of us actually know what it looks like in practice. Bear with me. We're on our journey. We're now going to transition to critical theory. Okay? So, as I said, go through both of these, and when we get to the second part, to critical race theory, you'll understand how all of this ties together. All this information here today is foundational, and it's absolutely critical. So there were Marxists, people who read Marx and believed what Marx had to say, but they felt that oppression and exploitation and victimization was not limited only to economic relationships within a capitalist society. They felt that it could move beyond the borders of capitalism, and that other aspects of society also could be involved in exploitation and oppression. So, critical theory, it's an advancement of Marxism developed through the Frankfurt School. Critical theorists agreed with Marx that the institutions of society were responsible for exploitation, but the sources of exploitation were not limited to economics. Critical theorists saw exploitation happening within every level of every institution of society. So there are two critical points about critical theory. Exploitation was so embedded that those who benefited could no longer see their exploitation. It was unrecognizable and completely normalized that the oppressors called exploitation truth. It could not see beyond their privileged advantage. The second point is institutions that had embedded systemic exploitation were beyond rehabilitation, and these must be broken up and replaced. So, I want to read what is a course description for Philosophy 336 called Marx and Critical Theory from Amherst College. I do this because I want people to see what these ideas look like when they move from the theoretical writings of maybe Marx or the critical theorists, and they begin to creep into academia and then into society. So this course description is fairly typical for what you would see in any college curriculum on a similar subject. Again, it's Marx and critical theory. And so this course description says, a critical theory has this distinctive aim to unmask the ideology falsely justifying some form of social or economic oppression, to reveal it as ideology, and in doing so to contribute to the task of ending that oppression. And so a critical theory aims to provide a kind of enlightenment about social and economic life that is itself emancipatory. Persons come to recognize the oppression they are suffering as oppression, and they are thereby partly freed from it. Marx's critique of capitalist economic relations is arguably just this kind of critical theory. As participants in a capitalist market economy, we fall into thinking of the economy in terms of private property rights, free exchange, the laws of supply and demand, etc. And in doing so, we fall into thinking of capitalist economic relations as justified, as how things should be. Marx argues that this way of thinking is doing nothing but masking ideology. It obscures, even from those persons who suffer them, the pervasive and destructive forms of alienation, powerlessness, and exploitation that in Marx's view define capitalist economic relations. Any prospects for change, reform, or for Marx, revolution, requires first that people come to see capitalism for what it is, for they must first see the ways in which they themselves are alienated, powerless, and exploited before they can try to free themselves from it. Later social theorists in what came to be called the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and Habermas, develop and refine this Marxian project of providing a critical theory of capitalist economic and social relations. In particular, they argue that the forms of oppression distinctive of late capitalism are importantly different than the forms Marx found and the early capitalism of the late Industrial Revolution. And so a critical theory about them must also be different. It's a lot of words. You can go back and reread it if you want. But here's what he says, that ideologies become, and these corrupt institutions become so normalized within society that people see them as being just the way they should be. And so for Marx, a critique of that, his critical understanding of it, which led to the destruction and the reformation of societal institutions, was absolutely necessary. But the last sentence is important. When they say early capitalism was different than later capitalism, so a critical theory about them must also be different. What they're saying is they're expanding it beyond the realm of economics alone. And they're going to take a wider look. Now, this is from Jorge Lukács from the Frankfurt School. He says, I saw the revolutionary destruction of society as the one and only solution to the cultural contradictions of the epoch. Such a worldwide overturning of values cannot take place without the annihilation of the old values and the creation of new ones by the revolutionaries. And this really is walking in complete unison with what Marx proposed and what Lenin, Mao, Pol Pot, and others attempted to install. The destruction of Western capitalist societies in order to impart and enforce a new set of cultural values, a new societal system that brings a new form of justice. That is critical theory. And that is the paradigm through which critical race theory emerges. And ultimately, the question for each and every one of us is, how tied to critical race theory, how tied to Marxism is critical race theory? And what does its expression look like within academia and our greater culture? And that's the question we are going to tackle in part number 2. I want to thank you for being a part of our discussion today. If you've got any comments, please leave them below in the comments section. As always, like and subscribe. We appreciate it. Please support us on Patreon. And until you are back with us again, we wish you peace.